Our next speaker needs absolutely no introduction. Dr. Richard Wright attended Harvard Medical School and stayed for training in internal medicine and cardiology at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And during those 11 years at Harvard, he took a year off and served as a medical missionary for a Stone Age tribe in the Amazon jungle. Dr. Wright has been lecturing all around the country, 49 states, to over 2,000 cardiologists, over 50,000 lectures. Was the president of the California chapter of the American College of Cardiology, and currently represents us 30,000 American cardiologists as their representative at the National Committee that advises Medicare on physician reimbursement rates. For 10 years, he also served as the cardiologist for the great apes at the Los Angeles Zoo. I can go on and on. We have been blessed to have him speak to us for 20 years. He's been coming to Reading. And recently, he was honored as being one of the masters of cardiology. If I'm not mistaken, there's not more than 100 masters of cardiology. A great distinction. Welcome, Dr. Wright.
Well, thank you, Mo, for the introduction. Jeff, I appreciate you did that shout out to Gene Braunwald, who was, of course, my mentor at the Brigham. And I'll give you one vignette of why Gene was so great. Not only was he a consummate clinician and sort of scientist, but he worked really hard. I was writing a manuscript with him for the New England Journal, and I got a call from Gene. He goes, Rich, meet me Friday at 9 o'clock because I want to go over the manuscript with you. So I show up at 9 o'clock in the morning, and Mary, his secretary, says, no, 9 o'clock tonight. So I come at 9 o'clock on Friday night, and there was a line out the door of Gene's office for people waiting to meet with him to go over manuscripts and things. And that was what he did. We had cardiology rounds on Saturdays, right? So he worked really hard all his life, and that's one of the reasons he was so productive and was really a mentor of a whole generation, actually more than one generation. So we will miss him. He was still productive. Even though he was 96 years old, he gave grand rounds 3 weeks before his death and was still quite active. So there are lessons there. So we're going to talk about hypertension, and this is an area that every single, aortic stenosis is going to afflict a certain percentage of us, but the vast majority of people in this room are going to have hypertension. And so this is not just applicable to our patients, but also to us. And I'm going to take a step back. We're going to talk about what exactly is the concept of hypertension. I'll give you the history of this because I think if you understand where we've come from, it's a little easier to understand what we should perhaps be doing. These are my conflicts. I serve as consultants for these companies. Many of them have medicines in this particular space, but I honestly don't consider any of these to be conflicts of what we're going to talk about today. I showed this slide last time I spoke about this, and it's, I guess, relevant even today. These are three leaders of the world trying to decide how to divide up Europe after World War II. And of course, you see Churchill and FDR and Stalin there. And the day of that conference, their blood pressures were listed here, okay? Now, the reason these blood pressures were so high, A, it's a common problem, but B, in 1945, when this photo was taken, there was not a single antihypertensive that existed. So we had the natural history of hypertension manifest in the 1940s before we had pharmacologic therapy. All three of these individuals died of stroke related to their hypertension. The first who died later that year was FDR, but all of them died of stroke. And this is FDR's blood pressures, okay? He had twice a day his White House physician, and of course he served 4 terms as president, so we have a record of his blood pressure twice a day for the entire term he was president. And if you look at most of his presidency, his blood pressures were 180 to 200, and during the war, over 200 was his typical blood pressure. The day he died, it was 300 over 190, pressures that you've probably never seen before. And that's because when you have effective therapies, we don't see people like this anymore. They still exist in certain parts of the world, but we're fortunate here in America that we actually, partly because of changes in lifestyle, you heard about smoking, et cetera, but honestly, mainly because we now identify and treat these people. So let's talk about how we identify the people. You may not think that taking blood pressure is a high-tech technology, but it took hundreds of years to figure out how to measure blood pressure. And the blood pressure story really starts with the concept of the heart as a pump. And of course, William Harvey in this famous book, and at Harvard I was lucky enough to go to actually hold this book and page through it because they have one of the original copies at the Countway Library of Medicine. But William Harvey described the circulation because prior to that time people didn't conceptualize that the heart actually pumped blood. They also didn't conceptualize about pressure. It seems like it should have been self-evident, but it wasn't, and in part because they had no way to measure it. 200 years later, they figured out they could start to measure it, but they didn't have recording devices. It was very hard, and if you look at these old devices, smoke drums and various things to try to measure blood pressure, and it took science another 100 years before people figured out, okay, what can we actually do? The first was this Italian who was able to, using a sphygmomanometer arm cuff that looks almost identical, literally almost identical to what you use today. But he was just looking at pulsations on this thing, and it took the Russian Korotkov the concept, hey, let's use a stethoscope and listen to the brachial artery with a cuff. This is a cuff in my collection there on the right. That's one of the original blood pressure cuffs. And for the first time, you can measure blood pressure and do it on everybody and do it reliably and actually come to then measure what turned out to be an incredibly important predictor of cardiac and other events. Now, a couple of things about the physiology of blood pressure, okay? Blood pressure varies depending on where you measure it. And it's hard sometimes for people to conceptualize. The blood pressure is higher in the wrist than it is in the arm, in the brachial arm, and it's a little higher there than it is in the aorta. And that happens to do with the physics of reflectant waves that come from the hands and the legs, et cetera. So the blood pressure actually rises as you go distally toward the arms, and then it rapidly falls, as depicted here, when you get into the arteriolar and capillary beds, and of course venous pressure is very low. So one question that always arises, okay, where's the best place to measure blood pressure? Is it the central aorta? Is it the brachial artery? Is it the radial artery, the femoral artery? Most of us have focused on measuring the brachial, and all the data that I'm going to show you is based on brachial. That should be where it's measured, and that's relevant. During later this talk, I'll talk about home blood pressure monitoring. And other than in very obese individuals, it's always preferable to use a brachial cuff rather than a wrist cuff for this reason. Secondly, initially, because so many people were dying of heart attacks, people looked at blood pressure as a marker of cardiac death. And there is some correlation here, but they really kind of missed the mark because it turns out blood pressure, although somewhat predictive of cardiac death, is way more predictive of kidney dysfunction, strokes, and other things, rather than just MI. But if you look at MI death, here's an analysis, and this is not a study, this is just looking at American men, okay? This was 12-year follow-up of over 300,000 American men. You take their blood pressure, you do nothing, you just see how they do over the next 12 years. And I want to spend a little time on this because there's a lot of data here that's different than what most people think, okay? So if you go from right to left, that's diastolic blood pressure going from less than 70 to over 100. If you go from the front to the back, those are systolic pressures. And a couple of things, if you go from right to left, look at the blue or the purple there. Diastolic blood pressure does not really portend cardiovascular death very much at all. It's not a very good marker. Most of the information is contained from the front to the back, which is systolic pressure. So when I focus on blood pressure with my patients, I'm only treating systolic blood pressure. That's the only thing we look at. And indeed, in your older individuals, which as a cardiologist is basically 100% of my population, right? My average patient's in their 80s in my practice. Probably reflecting my gray hair, I guess, but it's true. And if you look at the last bars there in that sort of bright pink color, a high systolic and low diastolic portends the worst outcome from a cardiac view, by far. So when people come in and they're 160 over 100 versus 160 over 60, the 160 over 60 group does twice as bad. in terms of the number of heart attacks. It's a huge predictor. And that's called the pulse pressure. You heard that earlier. The pulse pressure being the difference between systolic and diastolic. And what that tells you is how stiff the blood vessels are. So what makes stiff blood vessels? It's hardening of the arteries, atherosclerosis, right? So it's a marker. This is a biomarker of how stiff your arteries are. And when you're young, your arteries are very flexible, and as you get older, they lose some of that. So this is a surrogate for aging and for atherosclerosis. Now, getting back to this MI, and the reason I want to focus on that is a lot of the original trials of blood pressure drugs focused on, can we reduce heart attacks? And they got the wrong answer because they were looking at the wrong things. I'll show you in a minute. But this is heart attack, again, in the same Mr. Fit 300,000 people, adjusting for age, looking across things, and there is clearly a correlation between systolic pressure and heart attack. You can see it here. But notice that most of the inflection is in pressures way above what you and I see in our general population. If your blood pressure is 130 versus 140 here, there's not a huge difference in heart attacks. Turns out there is a huge difference in heart failure, stroke, and kidney disease over that lower end there. But most of the heart attack data are really in people way far to the right. I mean, not a lot of you are going to see people at 170, 180, 190, 200, 210 in your everyday practice. And that's because, as I mentioned, blood pressure not a great marker for heart attack, a really good marker for other cardiovascular events. Last concept before we talk about how to measure blood pressure and how to treat it. Blood pressure is not an independent variable. It's actually associated with your cholesterol. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. I went back a minute ago and said systolic pressure is a biomarker of stiffness of your blood vessels. If you have a high LDL, your blood vessels, as they age, will become stiffer because of plaque deposition in the arteries. And it turns out in big databases, this is over 500,000 people in the UK, and it turns out if you just do genotyping to predict what their LDL is, or you actually measure their LDL, there's a strong connection between your LDL level and your blood pressure. So blood pressure is not an independent variable. It's correlated with other things, including here your propensity or your actual likelihood of having an elevated LDL. So when you measure somebody's blood pressure, you're actually getting insight into the health of their blood vessel, including things like what's their lipid load been over their entire lifetime. Now that said, I mentioned blood pressure varies with lots of things like where did you measure it, but it also varies with where you live. So if you look at America, or in this case, the slide's from Argentina, and if you look at the green, which is systolic pressure, it invariably rises in industrialized countries. In America, it rises just under 1 millimeter of mercury per year. Unlike diastolic, which peaks in the 50s and then drops down because of the stiffening of the vessels, which is why diastolic pressure loses its benefit in terms of a predictor model. So we're focusing on systolic, and notice that there's this inexorable rise in the general untreated healthy population. Okay? Now that isn't true, and you heard from Mo that I spent time with a pre-industrial Stone Age tribe of headhunters actually in the Amazon, where believe me, if I dropped you in the Amazon, I told you feed yourself, you'll realize immediately how hard it is to live when there is no supermarket, and you have to grow yucca and bananas and hunt monkeys to survive. But if you look at their blood pressure that I've circled in green here, the adult Stone Age tribespeople of the world have blood pressures in the 90s typically. I don't care if you're 40, 50, 60, or 70 years old, your blood pressure's in the 90s systolic in those primitive populations. That's because, if you look at these, this is the slope with age. This is how much does the blood pressure rise as those people get older. Notice the number is 0. Their blood pressure does not rise. They maintain pediatric blood pressures their whole lives. Unlike to the right, where it says here the remaining 48 countries, the right column there, turns out that in the world, the average blood pressure rises 5 per decade. Here in the US, it's 8 per decade. So there's something, it's not that when you move from the Amazon to America that somehow your genes change. There are environmental influences that lead to this rise in blood pressure. We are not sure what those environmental influences are. There's a lot of focus on sodium. I'll show you a slide here in a minute. And there is a connection between how much sodium is in your general water supply. If you look at the sodium intake, the highest sodium intake in the world is in northern China, and they have a very high incidence of stroke there, by the way. Just to put that in perspective, the average, in northern China, the average Chinese person eats 6,100 milligrams of sodium per day. Okay? 6,100. In the Amazon, the average Amazonian Indian eats less than 100, right? The tribe I was with, it's about 40 milligrams per day. Salt is very rare because if you don't have salt, you don't have prepared foods, and you're growing your own bananas, guess what? There isn't a lot of salt in bananas, you know? So it turns out that their difference is huge, 6,100 versus 50. I mean, it's a 100-fold difference. They also, because they're eating fruits and vegetables, they have a higher potassium intake. And the biggest difference is the sodium-potassium ratio in their diet, which is 1,000-fold different than what you and I eat. So it's possible that some of what we're talking about is influenced by these over a lifetime, these sort of sodium and potassium. You heard about magnesium earlier. Magnesium lowers blood pressure, potassium lowers blood pressure, sodium, and most people, as I'll show you, raises pressure. So it could be little things like that that influence every single day for the next 80 years of your life, your blood pressure. We are not sure. It's incredibly difficult to do studies in this arena. You can't take a population and randomly assign it to high sodium, low sodium for their lifetime. So most of these are epidemiologic observational data. And further complicating the picture is blood pressure varies 100%. It's one of the few biometrics that you use to make clinical decisions that isn't a fixed number. Imagine if the serum sodium varied by 100% over day and night, and I mean, you wouldn't know what the heck to do to get a blood test, you know? You think things are stable. You measure a blood pressure at one point, it's gonna be varying by 100% over the day and night. And that's because activity, whether you're sleeping, things like the temperature of the air in your exam room, what day of the week it is, whether it's winter, whether it's spring, did you just have a meal? Is your bladder full? Are you in normal rhythm? All these things make the blood pressure vary. But more importantly, it varies because people, when they come to the clinic or your office, they have this white coat effect. And it's quite striking, the white coat effect. And it's very difficult but important for us to extract that out of our data to decide about clinical decisions. Lastly, selective reporting. There was a very interesting study where they gave people blood pressure cuffs and said, go home and measure your blood pressure. I want you to jot them down and bring back the log, okay? They didn't tell the patient that the machine secretly recorded all the blood pressures. And then when they compared the secret recordings to what the patients reported, there was this selective reporting. Any high blood pressure, the patient left off their log, and they only wrote the ones they think you wanted to see. So just be aware of that, you know, and have this discussion with your patients. But I want to show you the data on white coat effects. So this was, they put arterial lines in people, and then they had them lay around, and then they just measured what happens when you put the cuff on the arm, okay? Just wrapping the cuff, the blood pressure instantly went up 10 millimeters of mercury, okay? On inflation, the cuff went up, and this is the anticipation, right? This is the anticipatory effect. Oh my gosh, maybe the blood pressure is going to be high. So the blood pressure goes up just by the act of taking the blood pressure. The physician enters the room, the blood pressure went up 20 millimeters of mercury. Man, I don't know what to say, but 5 minutes later, people say, let's take it 5 minutes later. Guess what? It's still 12 milliliters higher than it used to be. So just the presence of the caregiver makes a difference here, even 10 minutes later. But if you put a cuff on and you leave the room and the cuff automatically just inflates every few minutes on its own, the brain ignores it. It's like white noise. It's like listening to the traffic, and when you're in your office, you don't hear the traffic unless you focus on it. Or hear the murmur, I guess, unless you focus on it. So it turns out that ambulatory blood pressure monitoring gets rid of the white coat effect, which is why you've heard me before. I'm such a proponent of 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitoring because that is considered the gold standard. People have tried using home cuffs. Obviously, here's a panoply of home machines. You can go to any drugstore, you can go to Costco, et cetera. You can buy over the internet these home blood pressure cuffs. A couple of comments about them. First of all, they use a form of technology similar to what you use. If you have an automated blood pressure cuff at the hospital or your office, that's about a $2,000 machine. These are $50 machines. How can they make a $50 machine work? Well, the answer is they don't. It's an algorithm that's built into a $1 computer chip. The algorithm looks at a deflation oscillometric method, and what it does is then compute this typical slope means a blood pressure of 122/78, and that's what it displays. It doesn't actually measure, per se, the blood pressure. And that's why these cuffs are suspect in terms of their validity. If you look at, at cuffs. These are cuffs that were put onto a machine to measure validity. It wasn't actually putting onto an arm, which has other influences. But here's a machine, for example, where the blood pressure was precise and accurate. This is one of the brands that you can buy. And compared to machines, this was spot on. So this particular machine had a better algorithm. Here's a machine where it was both imprecise and inaccurate, where if you look across the top, one time it read 120, the same exact machine, and then it read 100, and then it read 118. So the actual pressure was 120, but one time it read it as 100, right? So this is not precise, meaning it was the same reading over and over, and it also wasn't accurate. Here's the most common machine in the US, which is about half the machines, which is Omron, and it's very precise. It gives the same exact reading every time, except it was 10 points too high. Okay? And 10 millimeters of mercury I would say would influence your choice of whether you're going to put somebody on therapy, your lifestyle changes, all those kinds of things. So just be aware that precision and accuracy, and especially for cuffs that are older, they start to lose their ability to measure things. And furthermore, here's a scatter plot. These happen to be blood pressure monitors comparing two different types of blood pressure readings. It turns out if you certify a cuff, let's say you and I come up with a cuff and we go to certify it, it turns out if your blood pressure machine is within 5 millimeters of mercury for the herd of people, then your machine is considered accurate. Okay, that's the current definition that gets you certified. But the problem is, think about what we just said. It sort of goes through the clinical trial thing you heard earlier, and that is, if I had a cuff that read 10 millimeters high in every man and 10 millimeters low in every woman, it's certifiable because in the herd it's spot on. And yet it's inaccurate for 100% of people. So just be aware, if somebody's going to say, I want to use my home machine, bring it in and have you correlate it either with an aneroid cuff, a mercury cuff if you still have one, or your own oscillometric cuff. And if it's off by 5, use that as a tear factor. It may be 5 high, 5 low, but use that as a tear factor to subtract or add so you can use home machines. Better is to use a 24-hour blood pressure, right? So I read all of these at our institute. I've read literally tens of thousands of these. It is stunning how different these may be compared to home blood pressures or to in-office readings. Here is our validated data. Here in gray is prior to medical therapy, drug A. Here, virtually any blood pressure drug will lower your blood pressure. That's in yellow if you add a second drug in the turquoise color. And this is typically what you see, right? Highest in the morning, lower in the afternoon, then really low at night, and then prior to awakening, you have the hormones be secreted and things, and your blood pressure starts to rise starting at about 4 in the morning. This is absolutely what you see in virtually everybody. Now, if you dissect this out, you can then say, okay, what do these readings mean with regards to outcomes? Well, let's first compare it to readings in the office, right? So on the left are office readings that are always below 140. You put blood pressure cuffs on these people, and you compare them to people whose always blood pressures are 150 in the office, and it turns out that if their blood pressures are normal at home on 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, that the presence of white coat hypertension doesn't really mean much. Okay, it doesn't mean much. It means they're a little more likely to develop high blood pressure. There's a little signal there, but it's not very important. That's 25% of all the people that come into your office. Okay? 10% of the people have what is termed masked hypertension, which means their 24-hour blood pressure is higher than the office readings. How could that be? I call those the bad marriage people. Because who could have a higher pressure at home than in the physician's office? Well, it turns out it's 10% of people, right? So those people, you would never know they had elevated blood pressure because they come to your office and their blood pressure's normal or fine, but in fact 10% maybe. And this is actually one of the currently paid for indications for 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. But more importantly is the most important signal is how their blood pressure is at night. And what I tell people is, listen, if you're sleeping and you're relaxed, your blood pressure's high, you got a problem, right? But you're never going to know that if they only take readings in the office or if they're taking their home readings, because you can't take your own reading when you're asleep. So sleep readings, it turns out, if you know they're nocturnal readings, it actually gets rid of most of the data that's useful during the day. As a univariate marker, home blood pressure readings during the day are useful, but the most important readings are nocturnal. And somebody did this informativeness, which I love this term, And this is a very large number of people, all of whom had 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure. And it turned out if you look at prognosing how somebody is going to do, yes, you can use systolic blood pressure in the office, but it turns out if you use the average 24-hour systolic, it's 5 times more informative for clinical decision making, but the single most important for predicting death and cardiovascular events was average nocturnal reading. It was 6 times more useful than what you get in the office. And yet if you don't get a 24-hour blood pressure, you're never going to know this. So this is an important metric for deciding, okay, do I add a blood pressure drug? Do I treat their lipids more aggressively? Do we put them on colchicine, aspirin, et cetera? Because this is an important marker of cardiovascular events. That's why the U.S. Preventive Task Force has strongly recommended that this is the reference standard for hypertension. I will not actually tell somebody they have hypertension unless they get a 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure. And as I said, we do these every day in our office. Now, I've used the terms hypertension and high blood pressure almost synonymously, but I want to point out these are not synonyms, okay? High blood pressure is a physical finding. It is not a disease. Hypertension is the disease, right? And think about, there are people that have high blood pressure who don't have hypertension and vice versa. You can have an extreme white coat effect and your blood pressure is totally normal the rest of the time. You can have people that have what I would call hemihypertension. I had a gentleman sent to me for intractable hypertension. Turned out he had an interrupted aorta, right? He had an aortic coarctation that was 100% stopped, and everything below his mid-body was low pressure. When I took it in his leg, his pressure was 60/40, and upstairs here it was 160, and the guy was on 5 antihypertensives, and it turned out he had an aortic coarctation. The interesting thing about him was that he had terrible atherosclerosis in the upper half of his body, and he had none in the lower half of his body, which tells you that blood pressure in and of itself contributes to the development of stiff vessels, and that's why I wrote here that high blood pressure increases morbidity, but it's actually a biomarker. Think of hypertension as the biomarker of the health of your blood vessels. And I will try to convince you that when you lower the blood pressure, people do better. So lowering blood pressure in and of itself does better, okay? And you have to lower it more than we used to think, right? The sweet spot is 115 systolic. That's the sweet spot. So if you leave somebody at 135, you're missing the boat, because with simple therapies, you can get most people. And as I will show you, not only is it important to lower it, but there is a little difference with, do you lower it with drug A, drug B, lifestyle changes, salt restriction, et cetera. So let's go into that. But think about this. Hypertension is a biomarker because it tells you about things like atherosclerosis, heart failure, and predicts heart failure, kidney dysfunction, stroke, and to a lesser degree, heart attack. But it's really a biomarker of all these other things. It tells you a little bit about, are they exercising or not? Are they obese or not? Adiposity, lipids contribute to this, genetics, are they diabetic, et cetera. All those things come together with a simple biomarker of blood pressure. So it's a really, really useful marker for all the things that we look at. So let's look at lowering it. If you look at clinical trials, there is a general correlation here. Left to right is lowering blood pressure. The more you lower it, the better people do in terms of the vertical axis of cardiovascular events. Now, one thing I will say is most of these trials are old enough that they were done in an era where we didn't know what the target should be. So there were trials, as I'll show you, where they start with egregious blood pressures and lower the blood pressure. But let's first talk about lifestyle. Sodium, as I mentioned, is really hard to parse out. But if you look at short-term trials, and these are trials generally that go on for weeks at a time, and just look at, okay, put somebody on a very low sodium diet versus free sodium or added sodium, what happens to the blood pressure? So here are crossover. This is the best of the studies in which you take 200 people and you start them on either a high salt, low salt diet, then you flip them over to the other and you say what happens to their blood pressure. And what you can see here is the average person's blood pressure goes down 7 millimeters of mercury on a low sodium diet. Okay? So there is, in general, there's evidence short term that makes a difference. There's a big difference, though, person to person. This is the individual of all 213 people in this trial. And some people, when you put them on a low sodium diet, their blood pressure way on the left there falls 40 millimeters of mercury. It's incredible. The African Americans, for example, are more salt sensitive. On the far right, there are people whose blood pressure goes up when you put them on a low sodium diet. Maybe they're frustrated by their food quality. I don't know, you know. But at least in the average, salt restriction does seem to play a role in lowering blood pressure. But most of the time, you're going to focus on medicines. And as I showed you, when FDR died, there were no medicines. The first effective blood pressure drug came out of trying to develop an antibiotic right? The thiazides were being looked at because they're derivatives of sulfa drugs, and they thought, oh, this would be a good antibiotic. Didn't work at all as an antibiotic, but they said, gee, this is funny, people's blood pressures are going down. And that was the first antihypertensive in the late 1950s. So here is a list of, there are 64 different molecular entities and over 150 different combinations and things that you can prescribe today, okay? But it comes down to these, right? These basic fundamental groups. The thiazide type diuretics, mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, those were first developed in the 50s. Then we had ACE inhibitors that came out of the 70s and early 80s. The calcium channel blockers that came out a little bit later, and angiotensin receptor blockers. If you just use those fives and you use them appropriately, more than 95% of the time you can normalize people's blood pressures. And yes, I'll talk briefly later about the ones on the right in which there are now new things coming in the market, which is interesting, but you don't necessarily need those techniques or stuff. What you need is to use judiciously the drugs we have. So let's look at our database. This started with the HOPE trial, and this is now more than 25 years ago that they did the HOPE study. And the HOPE study, what the claim was here, that ACE inhibitors, in this case ramipril, lowered cardiovascular events even in normotensive people. That was what you read, and that's what came. The guidelines said, oh, let's put everybody with cardiovascular risk or events for need event reduction on ramipril or some similar drug. And you can see, indeed, there was a 22% reduction starting at about a year of therapy. But I want to point out, if you look at the blood pressure in that trial, which most people glossed over, turns out that the evidence was only in the people that had elevated blood pressures that ACE inhibitors helped. Indeed, in the far left here in the quartile, these are the quartiles. So there were a quarter of the people whose average blood pressure was 124 systolic when they came into the trial, and these are in-office readings. Turned out they didn't benefit at all. The benefit was all the people that had high blood pressure, right? So ACE inhibitors in a normotensive population, other than in reduced EF heart failure, it's not clear to me that there's any particular benefit. It's driven by blood pressure. Then you have trials like this. Look at this trial. This is a VA trial. This is the only place you could do such a trial. Let's take people with blood pressures of 180 and randomly assign half of them to placebo. It's like, are you kidding me? Who would do that trial? You can't do that trial. Well, they did it at the VA. And the trial here was ACE inhibitor versus no ACE inhibitor. You can see the average blood pressure in the 170s. They lowered it 30 points. And what they saw was a 30% incidence reduction of stroke. That's good. But they saw a 64% reduction in heart failure. And this gets at what you heard earlier is, as a clinical trialist, you need to decide what you're looking at. If they looked at MI in this trial, they didn't prevent MIs. They prevented strokes, but more importantly, they prevented heart failure. They didn't even look at kidney dysfunction in this trial. So you have to decide what is it that it's going to be impacted, and sometimes we're not smart enough to know what's going to be impacted, right, ahead of time. Here's another trial. These are big trials. You know, I mean, I'll put on my hat. I run our thick heart program, and big trials in the thick heart arena are like 600 patients. This is 19,000 people, right? So this is a big trial. This one asked, is there any difference between blood pressure drugs? The biggest trial was over 40,000 people in this arena. But the question is, if you have your choice of 64 different drugs, should you just throw a dart and wherever it lands, that's the drug you choose? Or can you be smarter than that? This trial actually had some very interesting findings. It was a double trial, meaning they were both measuring lipids using a statin and blood pressure. Now, on the right is the blood pressure. Turns out on the left, you know, you lowered cholesterol appropriately with atorvastatin. On the right, blood pressure was better lowered by amlodipine than it was by atenolol. Okay, that's a repeated theme. Beta blockers in older people are less effective for blood pressure reduction than is amlodipine. And it turns out that if you just looked at the outcomes, which was, again, MI, not the right outcome, they didn't decide appropriately ahead of time what the right outcome was. There wasn't a huge difference. Turned out that the p-value wasn't statistically significant here, except if they looked at the non-MI outcomes, which actually were dramatically reduced with amlodipine plus perindopril rather than the other group, which was atenolol plus thiazide. And look at these numbers. I mean, a 24% reduction in death from cardiovascular events, 23% reduction in stroke, et cetera. So again, looking at the right outcomes will change your impression, because the trial said, oh, there was no difference between putting somebody on a beta blocker plus a thiazide versus a calcium channel blocker plus an ACE inhibitor. Wrong, because they chose the wrong outcomes. And the interesting thing was, this is a multi-year trial. They looked at 16-year follow-up, and the group that had been randomly assigned to the calcium channel blocker plus the ACE inhibitor still had still had 16 years later a benefit. So drug choice does make a difference. And it's amplified in this trial by lowering cholesterol. In the people that lowered cholesterol, and we don't understand why this is the case, but the amlodipine group with atorvastatin did way better than the atenolol group plus atorvastatin. So there was a synergistic benefit of lowering LDL and lowering blood pressure. We don't fully understand that. Here's another one, hydrochlorothiazide versus amlodipine. Have your choice. What would you do? Well, it turns out that ACE inhibitor plus HCT is good, but benazepril plus amlodipine was better for blood pressure reduction. That's good, but more importantly is the outcomes, 21% fewer events, heart events. So it does make a difference which drugs you choose. Okay? It does make a difference. They're not all the same. How about how far do you go? Many trials now have shown this, whether they're here in America or in China, and it turns out what I said was true. The target used to be 140, and then it was 130, and there were questions about diabetics, but now all the recent evidence suggests that your target should be 120. And these are in-office readings, right? If you go for 24-hour, it's actually going to be lower than that. But look at the difference between leaving somebody at 130, 134 in this versus striving for 120. That's a huge difference. Way more important than taking vitamin D, I would say. Here's the primary outcome of the intensive treat, and just choosing medicines, the number needed to treat is 61. So the return on investment is quite striking, standard versus intensive therapy. And if you look here at the line of unity there, everything is to the left in favor of more aggressive therapy. So we have been missing an opportunity to help patients because we have been lax in trying to achieve blood pressure controls. Now, lastly, what's new in the horizon here? Wouldn't it be nice if you could just use your Apple Watch and have it tell you what your blood pressure is? Sure, it would be nice. The problem is the readings are really hard to interpret. This is using plethysmography. It sounds great, and the 23-year-old engineers in Cupertino think that's great. It turns out it just doesn't really work, and here's why it doesn't work, because they're all over the map, and looking at plethysmography is not as good as looking at the brachial artery. Okay? New drugs, are there some? Well, here's one. It's an endothelin blocker. Endothelin's one of the intrinsic hormones that is a vasoconstrictor. This was the first new drug approved in over 30 years because it said that it lowered blood pressure 4 millimeters of mercury. Well, you know, 4 millimeters of mercury, gosh, guys, you can do better than that just using amlodipine and spironolactone, honestly. So, how about denervating the kidneys, right? We have two methods of doing that, ultrasound or various electrical methods. The reason for this is that much of the sympathetic tone of the body arises from the kidneys, and if you denervate the kidney, it can't signal to the brain to increase sympathetic tone. Here's what happens to blood pressure. It looks like really good, goes down 10, 12, depending on the study. But if you do sham controls, the blood pressure also goes down, right? So remember, just doing a procedure lowers blood pressure even if you don't do the procedure. So you have to do sham controls. But now there are data, here's 24-hour data. So it does work. We do renal denervation in our particular institute, but I will tell you, I consider it a 3% of the population innervation, okay? So does it work? Yeah, for people that have really intractable things. What's coming out? Here's one, an aldosterone synthase inhibitor. Turns out that aldosterone is one of the hormones that raises blood pressure. It's been very difficult in the past for us to achieve this because the enzyme that makes aldosterone is very similar to the enzyme that makes cortisol. So when they were trying to prevent aldosterone, it turns out they couldn't achieve it because they were making everybody Addisonian. Now they're able to block the aldosterone synthase. So look at this, it does lower blood pressure, giving these, this is a pill, 0.5, 1 or 2 milligrams a day, and it lowers blood pressure quite significantly, but so does placebo, right? So you have to do placebo-corrected studies, but unfortunately, that drug in subsequent studies only lowered blood pressure a few millimeters. So where that will be, I'm not sure. Lastly, how about RNA interference therapy, right? Because we now use RNA interference therapy. I do as an amyloid expert. There are multiple different drugs now that go into the liver and tell it, turn off production. You have 25,000 genes. You can turn off any of them with RNA interference therapy right now, any of them. So let's turn off angiotensinogen. Here's what happens. Blood pressure goes down, and rather dramatically. So that will come. Here's 24-hour data. Really works, okay? But go back to just standard therapy. Just use poly pills. Here's a study that used low doses, I mean, how many of you have people on 1.25 milligrams of amlodipine? Turns out if you use a little bit of this, a little of that, it's what I tell my patients is the Italian recipe approach. Don't use a ton of garlic. Use some garlic and some oregano and some pepper. And if you do that with pharmacologic therapy, it's a superior approach. And you get fewer side effects. So it's the way to go. So here's the keep it simple approach. Choose one or two of the ones on the left. Yes, thiazides still work. You know, potassium, all those issues. Amlodipine has really surfaced as the best of the calcium channel blockers. We're big believers in ARBs. There are 3 now on the market that you can use for that. In most people, you're also going to use a statin because these things correlate, right? Lipids and high blood pressure. And then if needed, a mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist, right? There are 3 of those on the market currently. So those are really the simple ways to do it. And try to achieve a blood pressure of 120. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Questions? What about alcohol and blood pressure?
I'm in favor. No. It's really hard to parse those things out. And, you know, part of it is, again, the complexities you heard about clinical trials. I mean, if somebody drinks, in the old days, they were more likely to smoke. So trying to parse out, do they drink and not smoke, or were they having the martini with a pack of Camels and all those types of things that people choose to drink? I think what I would say is epidemiologically, it's probably neutral, as long as you're not a rip-roaring alcoholic. So somebody who drinks wine with dinner periodically, I'm okay with that. Yeah.
Well,
So the question is, okay, classes of drugs, broad classes. And she said it looks like the combination of a renin-angiotensin modulator, she's an ACE inhibitor, plus a calcium channel blocker is better than somebody on a beta blocker plus thiazide. True statement. Now, within a class, and most classes have lots of members, right? So you look at ACE inhibitors, ARBs, there are tons of those, and there are like 14 beta blockers, probably less difference amongst those. But amongst the ACE inhibitors, probably not a lot of difference. There is a difference with ARBs. For sure there is. I actually authored articles about this. And if you do 24-hour ambulatory monitoring and then you rank order, so the weakest is losartan, sort of the most gentle, if you will. And then if you look at the stronger ones, olmesartan and azilsartan are clearly better. And in randomized trials, and we did that, you get extra millimeters of mercury just if you use olmesartan versus losartan, for example. Now, in the past, that was harder to do because they weren't generic. Now, like olmesartan is generic, so it's actually a very good ARB because it's more effective and it's still cheap being generic.
What about in-office unattended blood pressure?
Yeah, so, and many of the question was, somebody comes into your office, they're gonna have a blood pressure. How about if you measure it when nobody's in the room, right? Sort of unattended, because then you get rid of some of the white coat effect. And actually what you said is true. If you put a cuff on somebody and you leave the room and you let them sit there quietly for 5 minutes and then it takes 3 readings and you ignore the first reading, and that's what was done in the SPRINT trial, and it actually was criticized. I think that's a brilliant thing to do, but the general consensus is, well, that's not the way we normally do it, so that invalidates the trial. No, it means we should do a better job of measuring blood pressure is what it means. So unattended blood pressures are actually better and more reflective of what it would be outside of the office. So if you have the time and the rooms and stuff to do that, that's a good idea. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, are ARBs superior to ACE inhibitors? For blood pressure control, they are considered essentially the same. The difference is ARBs have fewer side effects, that's all. So you really don't see cough with an ARB. I don't think ACE inhibitors, there's this, when something first comes out, so I happened to be at the Brigham when we were doing the very first trials in humans for ACE inhibitors. And believe it or not, because of course ACE inhibitors, the lineage came from a Brazilian pit viper and people thought people would go into shock, we had to admit people to our clinical research institute to start them on captopril, okay? and we gave them 1 milligram of captopril while they were lined up. I mean, it was like ridiculous in retrospect, but that's what we had to do. It turns out that ACE inhibitors, of course, have cough, and that's intractable in 5% of people. It's kind of the Achilles heel of ACE inhibitors. But if somebody tolerates an ACE inhibitor, perfectly fine with that. But I would consider those roughly to be the same, ARBs and ACE inhibitors. Yeah.
Ascot trial, you mentioned the benefits, but one of them you said minus 32% new diabetes.
Yeah.
What was that?
So the question, if you didn't hear it, was they tracked, and they didn't have access to every blood test, et cetera, but they tracked the clinical definition of somebody who used to be considered, you know, you have a little bit of hyperglycemia or you're pre-diabetic, who then crossed whatever the threshold was for the putting down the person actually has diabetes. And it turned out in the people who were randomly assigned to the ACE, the group that was better, there was a reduction in people who converted from pre-diabetes to diabetes. Okay, just going through chart review. Now, if you look at hemoglobin A1C and stuff, there are drugs that will nudge the, and this, of course, is one of the issues with statins, where there are a few people where it nudges up their sugar, and they go from hemoglobin A1C of 6.4 to 6.5, and oh my God, suddenly they're diabetic, right? So take it a little bit with a grain of salt, but at least in the clinical trials, if you randomly assign people to that combination, there were fewer of them who had the diagnosis of diabetes listed, this is type 2 diabetes, not type 1, on their medical record.
It has to be the amlodipine and the ACE inhibitor.
That's on amlodipine plus ACE inhibitor versus the thiazide plus beta blocker, correct.
A lot of these will come up in the Q&A. You guys should have all those answers because Dr. Wright's covered a lot. How about one more question?
We have one here.
Okay.
Quick comment about the blood pressure monitors. So a lady was freaking out because her blood pressure was extremely low, had her bring her blood pressure monitor in, compared it to mine. It was, her blood pressure monitor was really low compared to mine. It was in kilopascals.
Yeah.
It was an old monitor.
It was,
in,
yeah.
not millimeters of mercury. It was in
Wrong,
kilopascals.
yeah.
She'd picked it up out of her closet or something. So
Yeah.
just
Like-
because
like
her
the
blood
Hubble
pressure is low, check what
telescope,
it's on.
right?
Millimeters of mercury or kilopascals.
Yeah, so it's like the Hubble telescope. If you measure centimeters versus inches, you're going to get a little different reading, right? So, yeah,
All right, thank
Great.
you. We'll have time for more question and answers.